right, guys, this week our story is called Century Farm, 100 Years on a Family Farm by Chris Peterson, photographs by Alvis Apatis. So while I'm reading today, what I want you to be focusing on is your appreciative listening. What that means is listening for how the author creates a feeling or mood. How does this help you create a picture in your mind? What are some of the words and phrases the author uses to create pictures in your mind of this 100-year-old farm? How do these help you see what's happening in the story? Here we go. Century Farm, 100 Years on a Family Farm by Chris Peterson. I know a farm that's almost as old as dirt. It's a century farm, 100 years old. The barn is old, the house is old, the granary is old. The people who built the farm have died. The first cows and chickens and sheep are all gone. 100 years is a long time. But this old farm is still alive. Young cows graze in the pasture, young crops in the fields reach for the sun, young kittens totter around on a hay bale in the hayloft, and young kids still care for their cattle in the old barn. I know this because I own this farm. I grew up in the middle of the century in the middle of America on this middle-sized Midwestern farm. When I rode my bike up and down the barn walk while Mom and Dad worked. I didn't know my great-grandfather had built the barn from trees cut right here on the land. When I learned to milk the cows, I seldom stopped to think that my grandmother had milked cows by hand in the same stall. When I first drove a tractor in the fields, it didn't occur to me that I was plowing the same soil Grandpa had plowed with horses. But when I finally purchased the farm from Grandpa, I was continuing a tradition that began way before the turn of the century. Way back then, my great-grandfather moved to northern Wisconsin from Sweden. When he married my great-grandmother in 1893, she was a widow with 10 children, living in a log house on this land. She had a few cows, a few chickens, and a small flock of sheep. My great-grandfather bought a sawmill that same year. He cut trees from our land and sawed lumber for a house, a barn, and a granary. By 1896, he had all the new buildings and a new son, my grandfather. By the time Grandpa was old enough to help with the farm work, there were a dozen cows grazing in the pasture and ample crops growing in the cleared fields. Every spring, Grandpa plowed the soil and seeded oats, rye, and barley. Then he planted corn. When the rains fell and the sun baked the earth, he said you could almost hear that corn grow. Each planting season still starts when I plant alfalfa and corn in that same old dirt. The corn still reaches for the sun and whispers in the wind. When summer days were the hottest and driest, Grandpa forked hay onto flat, creaky wagons drawn by horses. He used grapple hooks to lift dusty heaps of hay into the hayloft, where it was spread in knee-deep layers. I'll bet some of that same old hay is still in our hayloft at the very bottom. But now I chop our hay and pack it into bunker silos. Then we load it in a mixer wagon, mix it up with corn and other grains, and feed it to our cows. In the late summer, Grandpa harvested the grain with the horse-drawn binder. He piled the sheaves into prickly cone-shaped stacks. Then a clanking, dust-spewing steam thresher separated the grain from the chaff. Today, I harvest grain from the same field with a machine called a combine. The combine cuts and threshes the grain before pouring it into a huge hopper. After the frost, Grandpa cut the corn by hand and stacked it in tall shocks. It took 10 men and 10 teams of horses to haul that corn to the silo and chop it for winter cattle feed. Today, my wife and I still harvest the corn after the first frost, but we chop it with the forage chopper pulled behind a tractor. Our equipment allows us to do the work of those 10 men and their teams of horses. Grandma cooked meals for all those workers on a wood stove in the farm kitchen. She also heated water for washing clothes, a job done outside most of the year. It took a small mountain of firewood to keep the house warm in the winter and the stove going all year long. Today, we cook our family meals in the same kitchen, but when we make cookies, we use an electric mixer and an electric oven. Every summer, Grandma had a big garden. She grew tomatoes, potatoes, onions, and beans. Cucumbers climbed up fences and peas climbed up poles. Flowers grew everywhere, hollyhocks, phlox, irises, and roses. She canned bushels of sweet corn, tomatoes, and beans. Hundreds of jars of homegrown fruits and vegetables stood in neat rows in her root cellar. Our family still plants potatoes and tomatoes in the same garden soil Grandma did, and we grow phlox and morning glories by the porch door. Along with housework and gardening, Grandma milked a dozen cows by hand both morning and evening. As our farm began to specialize more and more in dairy production, Grandma used milking machines to milk 20 cows. When my parents married, they helped Grandma and Grandpa with the chores. Dad also had a job off the farm. He and my mother lived next to the big farmhouse in the summer kitchen. Years later, when I took over the farm, Mom helped me milk 30 cows a day. Then after I got married, my wife and I milked 40 cows while our kids rode their bikes up and down the barn walk. Today, with our children and our employees, we milk 200 cows in a milking parlor we built inside the same old barn, surrounded by the same fields. The cows will soon live in a breezy, free stall barn that's being built in the old pasture behind the barn. Dad drives out from town every day to help with all the extra work as we expand our dairy. But work isn't all we've ever done here. Back at the turn of the century, sheep nibbled the grass in the field south of our house until it was so short that my uncle could practice golfing there. Tree stumps and sheep sometimes got in the way. Today we golf in town, but each spring my son still practiced driving golf balls across that same field. On gray winter days, my great-grandfather used hand tools and pine lumber to build rowboats from pattern he's brought from Sweden. In the summer, Sundays were spent fishing for bass from one of those boats on a nearby lake. Today, my kids paddle a canoe on that same lake when they fish for bass. So much has changed in 100 years, but many things have stayed the same. We still work together when a cow needs help giving birth to a calf. We still grow hollyhocks in the same garden where Grandma grew them decades ago. And we still plant in the same soil that grew the timber for our house and barn and granary. My kids have grown up on this farm just as I did, and my father and grandfather before me. They still play in the hay. They're learning to drive tractors and care for cattle, and they're learning to love the land like I do. Generations of my family have come and gone, each one adding to and changing the farm. Someday my children and grandchildren may work the same land that I have. With each new planting season, with each new generation, this century farm is reborn. All right, so I hope that you were able to create some pictures in your head as I was reading through the story of what the farm looked like 100 years ago and what the farm looks like now. Your assignment part of today would be to write a summary of the story, and I would definitely like to see the differences between the farm 100 years ago and today. And also the things that have remained the same, because it's important that not everything has changed.